everybody. Thanks for joining today's webinar, Data Intelligence in the Next Normal. I'm Archana Tatipalli, Solutions Expert at Digital and Data Americas team at Orange Business Services. Our first presenter today is Matt Stratton, Head of Digital and Data for Orange Business Services Americas, and he will be providing insights on data intelligence in the next normal, some use cases relating to the same, and risks involved in the personal health data in the next normal work life post-pandemic. And today's second presenter will be Ashley Peacock, Solutions Partner on Digital and Data Team for Orange Business Services Americas, and she will be covering the new risks and data management in the current topic of discussion, Next Normal. I will be acting as a moderator and help with Q&A throughout the session. You may anonymously submit your questions using the Questions tab, or you may chat as well using the Chat tab on right side, and only I will be able to see them. I will then be taking them to our presenters at the end of the session, and we shall discuss some of the questions. So let's get started. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Archana. And thank you, everybody, for joining today. To start out, I wanted to refer back to an earlier webinar in this series called Navigating Your Business Through Times of Financial Uncertainty. Our team in that particular presentation identified 3 areas where companies should consider investing during these times of uncertainty. Out of the 3, the first one was talking about becoming a data-driven organization to help business resiliency and also to reinvent your business model. So that's what we're going to be talking about today and diving a little bit more into that. But before I go into details, I wanted to first make sure that I gave you the description or describe the way that I define digital and data-driven. I know often it can be confusing the conversations on what exactly that means depending on where you're in an industry or an organization. So for our presentation today, the way that I'm describing digital is in 3 ways, there's 3 parts to it. The first part is, when people say being digital, the first part is really being open-minded. And what I mean by that is being open-minded to the fact that change is really the only constant, and you need to be adaptable, in a changing world. And that's true whether you're in times of uncertainty or, what we might call normal or the next normal. The second part is to have a business outcome focus. And that focus isn't necessarily, silo-based in understanding each silo of a business, but really being able to see across the business, across those silos on how the business works today, but also the entire ecosystem. So that includes your customers, your suppliers, your partners, and also your employees. So being able to have that broad kind of holistic look in the business. The third part of being digital, the way I describe it, is to understand how technology can be used across that ecosystem in order to help transform your business, into new ways of doing business. So those 3 aspects are, what I consider being digital. That term. The term data or data-driven, the way I describe it, is really it's about having the wisdom of how to leverage data for decision making, and being data-driven. I'm not saying if you have data and you're using it in reports and so forth that it's you're data-driven. What I mean by data-driven is that you are leveraging it, knowing how to use it, knowing when not to use it, knowing what data you have, what data you might not have, where the gaps are, understanding how to quickly integrate new data sets when you do have those gaps. Also, being able to understand, and consistently have interpretation across an organization, or at least understand when you don't. And then the last part is understanding and agreeing on what quality actually means for your data. Data doesn't have to be perfect. Data often isn't perfect. And so when you're defining quality, there's some level in a data-driven organization where you just need to know what that data is, what it represents, and the timeliness of it in order to make decision and know what supporting data you have. There's also one other aspect is if you don't have the data, knowing what to do in those situations, you can still be a data-driven organization. So both of those together combined are, create what I call a digital and data culture within an organization. And having that allows, an organization to change and adapt in the face of uncertainty. And so, this is a slide that we use often. It usually had said the world is changing and so is business, but in today's world, the world has changed, and so really businesses must change in this environment. The other message in this slide is about the era of standardization being over. And so, just to be clear, I'm not saying that standards are good or bad, and you shouldn't have them. But what I am saying is that standards themselves, you need to be cognizant of why they're in place and how you're using them. Also importantly, knowing that if something is standardized, a process, or there's a standard way of doing it in your industry, that is effectively, creating a level playing field. And so when you have that, you can have disruptors come in who are actually going to use it to their advantage by doing things non-standard ways in order to better serve a customer's underlying need. So you may have, certain ways of doing things in the industry, and these disruptors come in and completely upend the model. So if you're stuck in the standards, and often people inherit standard ways of doing things, you have to be very careful to be able to step back and look and see if those standards are applicable. A lot of the time, standards are implemented with the tools and the data and the metrics and the KPIs behind them, with what's available at the time. But we know that technology continually advances, and this is why those disruptors can come into a market and totally upend the current incumbents. So in those cases, incumbents may tend to have their gut reaction being a strategy of racing to the bottom on pricing while they're trying to figure out what they're going to do in order to compete in that market. And often that results in commoditized type of services, or in some cases when the disruptor is truly upending the model and serving the needs a completely different way, the business has to be able to change and adapt. And if the standard way of doing things gets in the way, that can be an issue. So with having a digital and data culture, you also need to have digital intelligence, which is really surrounding that ability of the data-driven part of digital and data, and that's really what we want to talk about for the rest of this session. So, talking about the next normal. We could go many different ways and talk about a lot of different things in the next normal. There's a lot of unknowns, right? Trying to predict what's going to happen. I think most people agree things won't go back to normal, to at least the normal that we're used to. But one of the things that's happened just now and will happen, continuing past this pandemic, is that people are being forced to change. Usually when there's technology advancing, modernizing, there's a certain adoption curve or innovation curve where you have early adopters and people in the middle, and you have laggards. Also in a digital world, and as companies are making that transition or have been, there's been people who were never considered to be people who would make it over into the digital channel for whatever reason, just because they didn't fit for their lifestyle. It wasn't going to work for them. They just were in a category that they just weren't considered to be adopters or whatever be adopters. In today's world, we're really forced into that, so that that innovation curve or hype curve or whatever you want to call it, everybody's forced. So not only do we have an increase in the number of people who use digital, who were using digital, but we have completely new users, and that impacts a lot of different use cases and the way that you react to them. And so having that data intelligence and knowing what data you have, what you need, what works, what doesn't work across your organization, being digital and being able to react and change and be open-minded is critical in these times. So let me take a look at just two areas. The first is in commerce. So when we talk about digital commerce, as a company, we look at things with our clients from 4 different perspectives. These 4 main areas of being able to use technology and data intelligence to optimize their business or to accelerate their business, meaning, in a commerce setting, understanding your customers better and how better to serve them with your product and services. We look at innovation. As I mentioned, disruptors, when they're coming into a market, they may completely change how services are provided. So, looking at helping customers understand the technology and how they can provide new services. And then last but not least is this idea of managing the risk in the regulatory environments within the market. And so across all of these, data intelligence is absolutely needed. If you look at the optimized category, as you have all these new digital users who aren't used to using, online tools or using mobile apps to, order groceries or, get whatever service you're providing, you can expect that you're going to have a lot more people running into issues. So you need to have your customer support organization able to scale up for that kind of volume of usage or users coming into the support channels. So things like having conversational AI through chatbots, having the data feed back into that to build, and help people redirect into a channel where they can get their problems solved without going into the queue for calls is obviously needed, because scaling from a few thousand regular users to tens of thousands is going to have a huge impact all over your business, but also in that support area. The other area is leveraging infrastructure data to better just manage the infrastructure and scale the infrastructure and deal with those eventual problems, whether it's outage or degradation of service. So using in this case network tools and monitoring like Thousand Eyes, or using application performance management systems like App Dynamics, or using something along the lines of a MoveSoft, which is an AI ops platform that can see across those monitoring tools, helping you to quickly use the computer to find the patterns that are causing that have the root causes identified, so that the people who actually are going to react can react to what the problem is, rather than spending a lot of time just figuring out where the problem resides. So tools like that, the data that comes in, you need to have that data intelligence of knowing how to use it and what it means and the quality of it in order to succeed with that. In the accelerate area, again, massive shifts in customer behavior, not just the new customers, but customers who maybe were casual users of the digital channel. All of them, are forced into this channel. So you have to ask, are the customer behaviors the same, and are your models that you're using the same? So you have to be able to react to that and be able to change your models. And again, having that data intelligence already matured in your organization it's going to be a lot easier to react to that. On the innovation side, self-serve kiosks, self-pay checkout. Again, a lot of users are going to be probably funneling into that, whether it's in the next few months or even possibly in the future. So the idea of having adaptable type of interfaces that are driven by AI and data for using maybe cameras that are figuring out basic demographics or sentiment and mood to help guide the actual interface to help somebody get through checkout or find the product that they actually want to buy. And then finally, on this managed side, using technology from like your wireless LAN in a store, or from IoT devices that are used for counting people coming in, using your camera systems, using edge computing on camera systems that are detecting whether or not people are wearing masks when they come into a store. Also being able to identify and have AI identify the areas if there is an incident where somebody's symptomatic and comes in and gets through, knowing at least where they've been in the store and how long they've been in those areas to really concentrate your cleanup efforts. So that's one area. The other area is within the return to work, or the new next normal workplace. So again, in the optimized area, you still have for example, going with all the remote workers, people going to remote workers from virtual places. There's companies that we've talked to have gone from 800 remote users to 15,000 within 3-week span. And I'm sure many people in your organizations have seen that. So just like the new digital users on the commerce side, there are a lot of users that aren't used to working remote, and setting up their home network to be secure for the VPN that you're using, or along those lines. So same message there around using infrastructure data, using the chatbot data, and the experience there to help minimize the blast radius when things do happen. In the employee area for acceleration, and this is really understanding your employee needs. whether it's measuring employee performance, leveraging Zoom or WebEx or any of the video tools and the analytics that come out of that, being able to use that to see how engaged employees are throughout the day, and also how is that actually leading to increased productivity and what impact that might have ultimately on burnout or isolation and your long-term retention of employees, especially if we stay in this remote worker environment. When people are at home, it's a lot easier for other companies to come in and try and recruit people because you're not going to show up to the office in a suit and tie and kind of telegraph that you're going to an interview. So you need to make sure you understand what's going on. I'm not saying you need to spy on people, but use the information and understand the engagement of your employees. The innovation, who knows what will be there. I put a few things in here, just telepresence, VR, robotics. There's all sorts of new ways of looking at things, with IoT devices. But the final one here before I pass it off to Ashley is in this manage category. When people return to work, the health and safety issues become critical, right? We all know that we're being asked to limit the amount of people going into an office, use social distancing, make sure that personal protective equipment is being worn, form of masks, being able to do that. Using wireless LAN technology, a combination of that with, being able to read the radio signals on people's smartphones of where they're traveling in the building, using, whether it's new camera technology, thermal camera technology, or existing CCTV camera technology with AI, being able to assemble from all of that data potential, where there are incidents that people come in, at 8 a.m. and they're fine, and by 1 p.m. they're completely symptomatic. Being able to use that to your advantage and have, internal contact tracing to know not just where you need to sanitize an area, but who they may have been in contact with and for how long. It's not not 100%, but by assembling this data, knowing how to get it together quickly, having that data intelligence capability and that maturity definitely allows you to get there faster. And the last point I'll have is, I mentioned thermal cameras. Depending on the use case, those can be useful investments. But if it's a short-term investment and you don't have too many choke points going into a building, you have to weigh whether or not you want to spend a few $1,000s on that versus just having somebody, with a thermometer managing, people coming through the security checkpoints. And at that point, when you do actually do that, whether it's a thermal camera or a thermometer, you have somebody new who's involved in the process of managing data, right? Managing what becomes personal medical data. Unlike the rest of the data, because you're taking a temperature of somebody and recording it, and there's the outcome from that. So it's a very important one, which is why I wanted to save that to last, because I'm going to hand it over to Ashley, and she's going to go through what some of these new risks that we're facing inside with data intelligence and the type of data that we may be adding to our environments. So Ashley.
Great, thanks, Matt. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit first about some of the regulatory risk that we incur in our next normal, and particularly in this very kind of acute stage of COVID. Regulations by their nature tend to be very reactive, and that puts us in the place of doing a lot of speculation as to where we want to be as a company and how we think the regulations are going to go. There are a couple regulations that have come out very quickly in regards to COVID. The Families First Act, also extending FMLA to cover public health emergency leaves. Both of those deal with time off and protecting jobs in kind of situations that jobs would not historically have necessarily been protected. The other one I want to talk a little bit about is HIPAA. HIPAA is kind of an interesting one. HIPAA is not likely to have a lot of direct impact on most companies, but because HIPAA has been around a while, there's a couple benefits there when we look at it. First of all, it's been around, there's a lot of interpretation, there's a lot of guidance that's already out there, so it gives us some very good insight into the general regulatory thinking on privacy and around health information. The other thing with HIPAA is that HIPAA is very relatable for people. We've all gone to the doctor, we've all had to fill out the form that says, I understand what my information can and can't be used for and my rights to privacy. So, as Matt mentioned, we have a lot of people that are looking at information that have never looked at this information before, and it's a good place to start the discussion because people can understand kind of how would I want my own information to be treated. The one I want to talk a little bit more about is the American with Disability Act. This was put out, ADA came out from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission 30 years ago, actually now, 1990. So it's got a lot of history there. It's very well understood. I think even those of us that don't work directly with it understand the concept of we can't discriminate against people that have a disability. And likewise, we need to make sure that we're putting reasonable accommodations in place for people that do have disabilities. And the reason this becomes particularly important with COVID is there is a clause in ADA called the direct threat clause. And the direct threat clause allows us, when there's a significant risk of substantial harm, then we are allowed to kind of bypass some of the other provisions from ADA. There's definitely some interpretive language there, kind of what's significant risk, what's substantial harm. But EEOC did come out back in March and say that absolutely COVID has met the threshold for substantial harm. They have not done this in other pandemics. So this is what allows companies to really start asking questions about, do you have COVID? And or have you been exposed to somebody else, so there's risk that you have COVID. Now with that, you cannot ask about other conditions, and this is one that we need to be a little bit mindful of, because we know with COVID that risk and mortality increases significantly based on other conditions. Those other conditions are not part of this substantial risk, and so therefore I can't ask you, you know, are you also over X years of age, or do you also have asthma or diabetes? Which is something that companies, I think, may intuitively actually want to do if they're not careful. As we're trying to plan who can come different places and trying to protect the health of our employees, that you will start to say, well, I don't want people to come in if they're at risk of higher mortality rates. Likewise, you can't ask about whether somebody's had a vaccine, and you can't force them to take a vaccine. Now, I threw a little bit of an asterisk on this one. Certainly true at a federal level. You cannot compel somebody to take a vaccine or ask about their vaccination status. That's personal health information, and it's not preventing a direct risk. But I think two things that we've seen recently in recent years. There's a lot of discussion around vaccines, and so there have definitely been municipalities that have enacted their own laws about vaccines. Comes up a lot when we talk about like measles outbreaks in schools. And so I would not be surprised if that gets extended when we start talking about when a COVID vaccine becomes available, if places either want to require it or regulations change that will allow us to require it. And the last piece I want to talk a little bit about is medical exams, because we are kind of under this direct threat clause, where we are, trying to ensure that we protect health and safety, public health, whether that's employees or customers. That we can do medical exams. The one that comes up a lot with COVID is taking somebody's temperature. When we start doing that, though, we are now collecting medical information, and we need to be very careful about how we store and use that medical information. It needs to be stored as a separate record. It needs to be a medical record, which is not the same as my employee file or my general HR file. I want to make sure that that information is controlled and is only going to the correct people. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about the management of that data and our data intelligence moving forward. In our current situation, data governance, data management becomes very, very important on a number of levels. We have, as Matt's talked about and we're all experiencing, we're working in very different operating models than we used to. We have people working at home. They're accessing information in ways that they never have before. Likewise, we have all of this personal information that companies have never had access to before because they've never needed it before. And we have individuals within companies that have never had to access personal information. The example that I use a lot is, I have an office manager that has previously managed the office based on availability and business priorities and looking at conference room scheduling. And now I'm asking that person still to schedule the office, but to look at things like, does Ashley have a temperature? Has she filled out her pre-work medical exam for the medical questionnaire for the morning? And so now I have access to a tremendous amount of personal information. I need to make sure that I'm using it appropriately, that I'm protecting it appropriately. Um, Again, the kind of constructs of security haven't really changed, but access control becomes very important, even beyond the personal COVID data. Just with people working at home and data being distributed in very different ways, we want to make sure that we have the appropriate access controls around that, that the security is there because we have a, a large database of very sensitive data that many companies did not have before. And on the note of that sensitive data, you want to look at your usage, making sure that you are only using it for appropriate purposes, that it's only being used as intended. That's, this comes up again when we kind of start talking about um, health information and information. Right now, people are very readily offering up health information, things that they probably wouldn't have before, because there is the risk of pre-existing conditions and comorbidities with COVID, that we're using that information to mitigate risk, but that it doesn't accidentally become something we use long term for health and for employment decisions and basing decisions based on health. So again, for the public health purposes, the spacing, contact tracing, that we're keeping information about who has been where, so that we can very quickly do contact tracing. You may have other things directly related to COVID. I mentioned before Families First and the public health emergency leave. So we'll have to look at different ways that you may qualify for time off, and just managing data that's specific there. The last piece I want to talk a little bit about there is making sure that we anonymize data. When we have these large data sets that we've never had before about kind of who's going where and doing what, and health checks, we will probably find some ways that we want to use that information to look at trends and how many employees come to the office when they have an option. That's perfectly acceptable. But what we do need to do is make sure that anything personal in that information has been obfuscated, and that really becomes an anonymized data set. So I talked a lot about data governance, data management on the last slide, and I want to talk a little bit about making that your foundation for long-term success and really using good data governance as competitive advantage and not kind of the necessary evil that a lot of people have seen it historically. Uh, Data availability has become very critical, as I think we've said a lot of times already in this presentation, that people are accessing data from different places for different reasons than they've ever needed to before. And so we need to make sure that we're distributing data in ways that is timely and useful, and that people are getting information at the right point in the supply chain, and also being able to contribute in the right place in the supply chain, which I'll talk in a second about the collaboration there. We want to make sure that we have good data. It's consistent, it's reliable, and people trust it. And trustable data is not always a simple point. It's not just a matter of having accurate data. It's making sure that you also have data that's very understandable. People don't trust what they can't understand. So to make sure that our data is understandable, that really is where we start talking about some of the kind of basics of data governance, and making sure that the data is defined, that people understand where it's coming from. If there was an option of multiple systems, that they understand why one system was chosen over another system. When people don't trust the data, they start doing some things that we don't want them to do. Um, either they're unable to do their job, right? They just can't make a good business decision. Or a lot of people, if they can't find it, they'll go find it themselves. And there is some benefit to that. We have self-service. But when people start going out and just creating their own data sets, creating their own indicators, they may or may not be getting the right answers. Not necessarily because of they don't know how to manipulate the data. Most of our users and our business people this day are very data savvy, But when we're looking across, multiple teams, multiple functional areas, people define things very differently. And if we don't have those data governance structures in place, then they're going to come up with their own definitions. And how I define something may be very different than how you define something. And we're going to end up looking at the same number and making two different decisions just based on the fact that we don't have the same understanding of the history of that number. Looking at collaboration, again, we want to make sure that people across multiple teams are looking at the same information, that they can talk in the same languages. We want to make sure that you have the appropriate level of data governance. Not too much, not too little. I think not too little is very understandable. We start to have chaos, we start getting conflicting numbers, but we also want to make sure that we don't have so much governance that people can't use and manipulate the data in the way they need to do their job. And that also that we do have the flexibility across teams to be able to use data in different ways. I also want to make sure that we've got the appropriate tooling in place, tools, talking partly about technology and making sure that you have systems that are usable to govern your data, but also just in terms of people and process, and making sure that people have the process to go in and really understand and define data, bring in new data, and understand the data that's there. And all of this is leading us to really the ultimate goal here is to be an adaptable business. We kind of all know the old adage that it's the companies that are able to adapt fastest and deal with change are the ones that are going to be most successful. And what we really see is that people that have very good understanding of their data and very good governance of that data are the ones that are able to adapt and to thrive ultimately. Looking at the fact that ultimately our goal is to be answering new questions and doing it in a very, very timely manner. Timelines, expectations continue to shrink, and expecting people to be able to react very, very quickly. We're answering all sorts of questions that we've never even thought to answer before. Business will continue to be that way. We're going to continue as technology changes to need to be able to answer questions we never thought of. We see that with COVID and looking at questions around, people wearing PPE and contact tracing that we just never thought before that we might need to track our employees at that level. Looking at data and accessing it in new ways, and with this everybody going and working from home, we're seeing people access data in ways that they never needed to access data before. And that, we can all kind of look at our own companies and other people we know, and the companies that were were able to quickly adapt to working at home, working remotely, versus those companies that really struggled with that because either they didn't have the tooling in place that's, made systems accessible remotely, didn't have the governance in place. I know a lot of industries struggled with this initially as they moved to working at home, as in the, how do I deal with personal health information at home versus, previously before, I know people like that do therapy at home that are doing it remotely. It was a very different operating model when you were in the office and you could really control that information versus when we're asking people to access that information at home. And the last point I had in here was about, making sure that we are able to structure our data so that it supports regulatory requirements. Really, it's the same concept as supporting any other user requirements, that we want to make sure that our data models and our governance is agile enough that we are able to quickly bring in new data sources, that we're quickly able to export to other data sources, to look at new numbers, and to manipulate our data as new questions come up that we've never thought to look at before, and as new data sources come up that we have not considered in the past. So Matt talked a little bit about data intelligence and the related use cases. I talked about the regulatory risks, how we're going to manage the data coming out of those risks. And I think with that, I will hand it back to Archana to manage some of the questions that's been submitted.
Thanks, Ashley. We do have some questions. So I think this would be a Matt question. How can we optimize the issues related to bias, AI, algorithms, systems, and user privacy when the digital transformation of information raises the concerns of cyber attacks?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. There's a couple of questions in there, I think. Well, the first one, with the bias in AI, you have to consider the use case of where you're using it, and make sure that the training data that you have is representational of the population that you're going to be the use case is going to consider. So if it's a very widespread type of AI use case in those situations, you definitely have to have a very large training data set, and so you have to get out and look for those to find those, and sometimes they're not available. So you have to be you do have to be very cognizant that the AI it's not magic. It gets. So the results in all cases with AI, there's it can help make predictions faster, make predictions cheaper, but it doesn't replace human judgment. And we found that with clients that have been implementing AI, that really the best outcomes include AI, but then human judgment to really kind of vet and make sure that what it's trying to say, or what the prediction is, actually makes sense, right? And it can be difficult with a lot of different industries where AI is a black box, and it can be incredibly difficult to understand why it came to that result. That's why having data scientists on staff or pulling them in from your partners is very helpful. On the second part of the question, I think when we talk about user privacy, and cyber attacks, it brings up to Ashley's point, this data that does come in needs to be anonymized. It needs to be de-identified, especially if it's health or any kind of private personal information. It's true before COVID, it's true during COVID, it's true after COVID. And so back to the point about governance, really having the data governance, having not just a program, but a function within a company, gives you that ability to see what kind of data you have, and make sure that the usage of it is understood, making sure that the data that comes in is always vetted for these reasons. Interesting on the cyber attack, I mentioned, with the just massive increase of remote workers, a lot of them are sitting on home networks. Hopefully the home networks are secure, and the routers, they've changed the default admin passwords and things like that. Even if you have your users using VPN, and you've got your own equipment that you're sending out, which going from, for example, from 800 to 15,000 users like that, if you're sending them equipment is now a logistical thing. But those raise very good questions about if people are accessing data on a personal device, is that device secure? And you need to include multiple groups, bring them to the table. So data governance isn't about just data intelligence reporting. It includes bringing in data privacy and security experts. So you really have to have that collaboration in order to manage that. I hope that answers the question. If not, you can email me later and let me know more about the question. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Next question, either of you can take this. So, what would be the best way to deal with employees' health and safety coming back to workplaces, which is also of economic cost and not too expensive? Any one method which you would be recommending?
I can take that. So I think.
Okay.
Sorry. So I think that's one that's I'm not sure there is a clear and direct answer to yet. That a lot of that depends on kind of where you live and what your current status in the pandemic is, and what your current government standards are. I can say that definitely as looking at companies and how we're trying to manage social distancing there, that individual companies are going to have to start making decisions, because we don't have direct mandates yet as to how we're going to manage that. We know some things about social distancing is going to be very important. Wearing PPE is going to be very important. So we can look at individual as a company, how we're going to manage that, kind of what technologies we're going to use to manage that. but I'm not sure that we have a direct answer yet on kind of what is going to be the single best way to bring employees back to work.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit to that because it does mention of not too expensive. I mentioned thermal cameras. Those are pretty expensive. They're not cheap. So when you talk about the economic cost, not too expensive for bringing employees back to work. Think about balancing the cost of that versus short-term cost of having somebody who's monitoring with a thermometer, right? If that's your only use case for the thermal camera, there might be better ways to do that. Also with any of these methods, anything that we're describing, obviously you need to consult with your HR and your legal and all those types of things, because your industry may have compliance issues that you need to consider directly, or the states that you operate in. For example, I live in California, which is got a reputation for a little bit of having laws on the books for everything. So you need to kind of think about that. If there's a long-term use case for something like that, if you're going to use thermal cameras for guarding perimeter and making sure that people aren't hopping the fence, maybe that's a good purchase. But really think about the long term, especially talking about PPE. I know in COVID we're talking about people wearing masks, but there's a lot of technology partners we have that have the capability to have edge computing cameras that actually can detect whether someone's wearing a hard hat in a construction zone, whether they're wearing safety glasses, a mask, other types of PPE, whether it's in a manufacturing environment, a laboratory environment, and things like that. So there could be good long-term investments in these short-term needs that you want to identify. But again, the data governance function is going to help identify those use cases, the requirements, and what makes the most sense. And one thing I'll leave you with is, when we talk about data governance, it's not an IT function. It's not an IT driven thing. It should be a business driven thing, because you want to make sure that whatever you're doing, it aligns with what the business needs, and where they're going. That's really, critical point there. That's why the collaboration, the adaptability, all of that, the business absolutely has to be driving that for it to be effective.
Thanks, Matt and Ashley. We have a few more questions. One of them being, with remote work becoming the norm, how efficiently can KPIs be tracked for performance management? And could increased monitoring and measuring of both qualitative and quantitative work of employees result in decrease in their morale?
Yeah, I could take that one. I mentioned a little bit about remote workers, the fact that they're at home, out of sight. So you do have the issue of isolation and morale. So you do have to manage to that differently than you would in an office environment. So just from a fundamental management standpoint, being able to check in with people a lot more often is an important thing to do. Right. The way you measure performance, are you going to be measuring, if you do today or did rather, measure people by, they're there at 8 a.m. in the morning and they leave at the right time at 5 p.m. Does that make sense in this environment? Does that actually lead to better productivity and to your actual business outcome? So there's those aspects. And again, I mentioned, you got to be careful. You do have a lot of access to data, from the infrastructure, from the video and so forth, that you could, conceivably collect and see what kind of engagement people have, and do some analysis to see, if people are on calls more, if they take breaks, are you able to retain them longer as employees, or do they end up leaving sooner because of that environment? So there's a lot of questions you can ask, and there's a lot of data. I would caution though, even though a business may own the infrastructure, the email, and be paying for it, and maybe legally be able to look at that data, when you want to understand your employees, that the employees are critical for a business running. So you got to balance, not making it something that is spying on people, and make sure it's not abused, and make sure that it's actually for the good of the company and the good of the employee, to make sure that in these times especially, that people are their well-being is taken care of. That's my opinion.
Thank you, Matt. Another question here is important data like financial, healthcare, etc. How secure are they with remote work? You did mention user privacy and anonymous data submission and bandwidth, uh, right? So probably Matt could take this, or Ashley, yeah.
I can take a stab at that. So there's a lot of variables there. Certainly, data security becomes very important. Um, and I think Matt alluded to this a moment ago, where we now have people that are working from home and they're working on their home networks. So we have some of these variables that are under our control, and that it's I want to say it's easy, but much easier to be able to manage what's happening on our own network and what's happening in our VPN. And it's certainly very possible to keep that information secure. There are a lot of companies that have managed financial information securely remotely for many years, and health information remotely for many years. But we do want to be very mindful of some of the changes now, particularly with people working remotely, and making sure that we're either checking up on the security of how people are accessing things at home, or that we're at least giving guidance there. Again, the changing the password on your router so it's not the default, and particularly around when we look at people that are using personal devices, making sure that we've taught people how to use good and secure practice on their own devices. I think will become very critical as well.
Thanks, Ashley. Um, the next question that we have is facial recognition entry. Do you think this would be limited to workplaces, or will it become a mandatory norm in every other place?
I think I can take that. I think in a workplace, always you have to be careful. I mean, different laws will be applied in different places. So, actual face recognition, in some places actually, I believe against the law, at least for now. But I think the key thing about when you talk about AI and facial recognition is, you can use it safely for use cases that are more about more generalized things. So you're not actually capturing who it is, and so forth. But again, you have to be careful of the bias. You have to be careful of any kind of discrimination issues that may come from it if you're using the data in ways that you shouldn't and you're not protecting it. I think in a corporate environment where people are coming on site, often people are signing waivers and things like that. So it's not just the employees, but it's visitors and partners and suppliers who are coming in. You have to consider that, and probably I think the safest answer with that is always check with your legal department, your HR department on how the company wants to handle that, and make sure that they are looking at it seriously. I hope that answers that question.
Thanks, Matt. We have one last question, time because of the time. So stricter rules may be imposed, but how effective would they be in data privacy management post-pandemic?
I can try that. So it's going to depend largely what the rules are, but I think that really post pandemic, I I would predict that they will be more effective. That we are looking at things, even if not from a regulatory perspective, as individual companies, we're having to answer questions now about how we are going to protect data and what types of data we're going to collect and what we're going to do with it around these very personal questions. And so I would expect that um, we as companies were much more proactively looking at these questions about privacy, about medical information, and that we should be able to apply those questions longer term to our general operating and our general governance that we do on a day-to-day basis.
Thanks, Ashley. I think we're almost out of time. Do we have time for more questions? Okay. So Here is the link to some of our upcoming webinars, and links to all the older ones are available on our website. Thank you all for attending, and we appreciate your participation today. Goodbye, everyone. Have a nice day.